friends. My name is Chris Heckley, and I am the director of the Gady Institute for the Liberal Arts. It is my privilege to welcome you to Still Dreaming, Race, Ethnicity, and Liberal Arts Education. You all have come from near and far, and the first thing I want to say is thank you. Thank you for making the journey, those of you who have come from a distance. Thank you for your interest in the topic. And most of all, thank you for the contributions that you will make to this gathering. This event was conceived as a learning opportunity for Westmont. Some here at Westmont have really valuable perspectives and experiences and research to share, and I hope you'll find that a really good resource for you. But I, at least, am here as a learner, and I'm grateful in advance for the insights and experience that you all will offer to our time together. I have a couple of introductions to make, but before I do, I want to do something a little different. I'm thinking about the title of our gathering. Is it up here behind me? Still Dreaming, Race, Ethnicity, and Liberal Arts Education. And I wonder what you hear in that title. I'm still a little uncertain about it myself, to be honest with you, and I think it might have been me who dreamed it up. Because it might resonate in different ways. Is that dreaming a reference to the DREAM Act, to dreamers, now known as DACA recipients? Is it a reference to I have a dream? Maybe more cynically, you must be dreaming? How about that still, in still dreaming? Is that persistence, or maybe exasperation? And are race and ethnicity being lumped together here, as if racism and ethnocentricity are the same thing? Or are they meant to be considered separately? And what about liberal arts? Liberal arts has like a half a dozen different meanings. Are we talking about small residential colleges? Are we talking about a set of academic disciplines, a curriculum, a pedagogical approach? So what do you hear in this title? I'm also thinking about the name of the event, a conversation on the liberal arts. How many times have you been invited to a conversation and then just been talked to? That would be easy to do here. I'm doing it right now. We have much of the format of a typical conference, and those are not often conversational. So I'm thinking we should break that mold for a minute or two and just talk to each other for a couple of minutes. Let's take 5 minutes, is that okay? And introduce yourselves around your tables. Now, some of you in the back there are going to just have to turn to somebody you kind of know or don't know at all. Introduce yourselves fast, because we're pressed for time. Just your name and your institution. And then talk together for a couple of minutes about this question. What do you hear in the title of this gathering? You've got 5 minutes for this, so be concise. Go. Can I just let that question sit and let your answers to it sit? It would feel like a pretty poor start to our time together if the white guy up front became the great interpreter of what we're doing here this weekend. It strikes me that my voice should not be the authoritative voice, that your voices should be. So we'll just let those responses to that question sit, if we may. I hope you get to keep thinking about it together. And I hope that these little conversations are a small foretaste of the spirit that will permeate our time together. There is going to be real value in hearing from our speakers. They are fantastic, but we can also be resources for one another. And in that vein, I might just say a couple of things about who's in the room. First of all, we have people from many different positions in their institutions. Faculty from a wide range of disciplines, academic administrators, student life leaders, folks from other areas of their college or university, development, public affairs, admissions. All of that is fantastic. Maybe best of all, we've got a bunch of students in the room who are living the realities that the rest of us are talking about. And we also have a lot of different kinds of institutions represented, from small private residential colleges like Westmont to large public research universities and everything in between. One difference that you might notice is that for some of us, those of us at Westmont, for example, religious identity is very much part of our college or university. For some of us, religious identity is not even on the radar of our institution, or maybe only tangentially, or maybe in the distant past. Just know that that diversity is intentional and welcome. If we at Westmont, just to take ourselves for example, were in conversation only with those like ourselves, we would definitely be impoverished. We've got to have input from those who share our concerns and share our hopes, but come from different perspectives, different backgrounds, and have different experiences. That, I think, is how learning works. In the end, whatever your academic field, whatever your position in your institution, whatever institution you hail from with its distinctive identity, your voice is not just welcome, it's eagerly sought. And I think this conversation on the liberal arts will be richer for it. So thank you. Speaking of who's in the room, may I introduce you to Dr. Mark Sargent, Westmont's provost. Mark has been with us for, is it 8 years now, Mark? He's a great practitioner of the liberal arts, a fantastic explicator of the liberal arts, and a powerful advocate for the liberal arts. We are very, very fortunate to have him. Mark, you want to say a couple of words of welcome?
Thank you, Chris. My words will just be a couple so we can get into the conversation. I've always been impressed that the founders of this event called it a conversation, as Chris alluded to, as an opportunity for people who care about the topic, in this case race and justice, and who care about the liberal arts and the ways in which the liberal arts can be nourished, strengthened, made increasingly relevant in our time. So welcome to you as our partners, as our collaborators, as the ones that are thinking with us about the road ahead on difficult questions like the ones that we will be encountering, as well as questions about the future of the liberal arts. So thanks for being our partners. I'll be with you tomorrow morning for our first session, so I'll keep things short, but it's certainly our hope that in the midst of this very challenging conversation that we'll all have the intellectual humility and the openness to learn from one another in ways that will increase our sympathetic understanding of different perspectives. And I'm glad that students have made an effort to be here and our guests have come from so far to be a part of it. Thank you.
You should also meet those of us who've been thinking and working on this project for the last year. That's our faculty and staff planning committee, many, maybe all of whom are here. Dinora Cardoso, she is professor of Spanish. Is Dinora here? Hi, Dinora. Thank you. Jason Cha is our director of intercultural programs. Jason. Here's Jason. Stu Pleak, our dean of students. Stu. Kaya Mangrum is assistant professor of English. Where's Kaya? Tatiana Nazarenko is our dean of curriculum and educational effectiveness. Rick Pointer, professor of history. Ed Song is scholar in residence and associate professor of philosophy. And Meredith Whitnaw, assistant professor of sociology. That is an amazing crew. Some of you know them well. And we owe much of the shape and content of this conference to their insights. So thank you all very much for your efforts over the last year. One last thing, and then we'll get to the good stuff. We do try to enact this idea of a conversation on the liberal arts right in the structure of the sessions themselves. So in the 3 plenary sessions, like today's, where we have a speaker, she or he will speak for roughly 45 minutes, and then instead of going right to Q&A, we'll take a short break. And the reason for that break is that we're coming back for extended conversation. Here's the trick. Try not to think of that time as a Q&A. That's not easy to do, because all of us are accustomed to these kind of events where the speaker is like the central focus, and we're going to ask our questions. But we invite you to try not to think of that as a Q&A. Rather, think of it as all of us being participants in a large group discussion in the room, for which the speaker has been a catalyst, and in which the speaker will continue to be an important voice. But so will you. Concretely, that might mean that in addition to questions for the speaker, we might have questions for the room, or responses to one another. Maybe even our speakers will have questions for the room. All of this will be shepherded by the moderator. The idea here is to sort of decenter that time from the stage to the room as a whole. Our concurrent sessions are also a little different from what you might be accustomed to at typical academic conferences. Those who have submitted papers will not be reading their papers. They'll be briefly recapping the main points of those papers and stressing elements about which they'd like to have further conversation, leaving ample time for thorough discussion. Again, those who attend the session are contributors, not audience members. But there's a catch, of course, there, and that catch is that you've got to read the paper in advance. So think about that as you settle in tonight. You've got papers to read for tomorrow, if you haven't already. And all of those link from the schedule that's on the web. All of the paper titles are hyperlinks to the papers themselves. Okay, that's more than enough preliminaries. Here to introduce this afternoon's speaker and to moderate the discussion is scholar in residence and associate professor of philosophy, Ed Song. Ed, please.
Well, hello everybody, and good afternoon to you all. I'm very pleased to be introducing the inaugural speaker for our conversations this weekend. Estela Bensimon is a Dean's Professor in Educational Equity at the University of Southern California, and the founding director of the Center for Urban Education there, which will be celebrating its 20th year of doing work to normalize racial equity in April. Professor Bensimon has dedicated her career to trying to increase racial equity in higher education, developing tools like the Equity Scorecard to help drive changes in institutional practice and culture. She is an elected member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow in the American Education Research Association. Just last week, Diverse Magazine selected her as one of the 35 most influential women in higher education. Her most recent book, of which I think there's information in your folders and maybe in back as well, is entitled Equity Talk to Equity Walk, which is authored with her friends Tia McNair and Lindsay Malcolm-Picot. Professor Bensimon's trajectory into the academy is unusual. Unlike some of us, she didn't grow up dreaming to be a professor. I don't know if any of us do. But she spent the first 10 years of her adult life doing community organizing work amongst Puerto Rican communities in New Jersey. And I think that's an interesting way to frame her heart and her vision and her mission for the academic work that she is doing. So please join me in welcoming Estela Bensimon.
And also thank you to Aaron for helping make all the arrangements for my visit today, and to Stu, who is an alum of the Rossier School of Education at USC, where I teach. And so I have to tell you that this is a very interesting meeting because typically I don't speak to audiences of liberal arts faculty. Most of the interest in my work comes from institutions that that have high concentrations of minoritized students and are trying to achieve equity in their educational outcomes. But I really like this setting. It's small, it's kind of cozy, and your campus, oh my gosh, it's really, really beautiful. So before I get started, though, I'm going to pick up on what Ed mentioned, that my trajectory has not been the typical trajectory. I wasn't dreaming about becoming an academic. And so what happened to me is that for the first 10 years of my adult life, as Ed mentioned, I was involved in community organizing in New Jersey. In Trenton, in Newark. I worked on the campaign for the first black mayor of Newark, and Ken Gibson. So I then was sort of co-opted by the Department of Higher Education in New Jersey, by the chancellor, and I was appointed to become the director of bilingual education because they were tired of me advocating and protesting. And so one day, Ted Hollander, the chancellor, said to me, you know, Estela, you're not going to get anywhere in life if you don't get a doctorate. So I went to Columbia University to get my doctorate in around 1979, and I have written an essay about this. I was seduced by the life of the academy. You know, suddenly I had gone from protesting, conflict, advocacy to the peacefulness of the patios at Columbia University, reading and thinking, and you know, and then I became an academic, and I got seduced. And I learned much too well how to do what academics do, essentially to write articles and books that other academics read. And so in 1995, I sort of had, a crisis, an intellectual crisis, sort of, where I asked myself, how could this have been? You know, how could it be that I left community organizing back there, and that now I am still writing about organizational change, but I'm not really doing it. And that was when I decided to change how I do my work. And I will speak about that today. And I founded in 1995 the Center for Urban Education. So the title of my presentation is Racial Equity, Higher Education's Unpaid Debt. And that is actually the theme of, I don't know if you're familiar with Change Magazine. It's going to be a special issue in March that I co-edited, and that is the theme of the issue, the unpaid debt. So before I go into the unpaid debt, let me just mention that all of the work that we do at the Center for Urban Education is based on the methods of action research, and which is essentially means that, going back to my community organizing roots, I decided the only way you bring about change is if you involve faculty members as well as staff and administrators in studying their own practices and asking themselves, why is it that I perform so much better for white students than I do for Black or Latinx students? And to do that, I use the methods of action research. We also do the regular research. You know, we have grants from the National Science Foundation, and we still do publish in journals. We also have coined, so one of the ways you bring about change is by changing language. So we have developed this principles of equity-minded competence. So what we're saying is, in order to be able to achieve racial equity in educational outcomes, practitioners, and I'm a practitioner also, have to become equity-minded. And in the spring, we're going to be releasing a survey of equity-minded competence for faculty. So let me tell you what I mean by the unpaid debt. So some of you may remember, this is about 2 or 3 years ago, there were many articles in the New York Times and in other outlets about the fact that Georgetown University had gone out of financial debt in the, I think it was probably in the early 1800s, by selling 272 slaves. And Georgetown now is trying to take corrective action around that. So when I'm talking about the unpaid debt, in part, I'm talking about the fact that our major institutions of higher education were essentially built by slave labor. And if you read the special issue of the New York Times Magazine 1619, which is a wonderful issue, it shows how much this country owes to the African American community in the building of the wealth of this institution, that wealth was made possible by enslaved labor. So that's part of the unpaid debt. The other aspect of the unpaid debt is depicted in this cartoon, which essentially shows the reproduction of inequity through what may appear to be practices that are objective around loans for buying property, in terms of who gets the jobs, and in terms of how police might treat differently white kids versus African American kids. And then you have Bob, right, who says, I never benefited from racism. So that's also part of the unpaid debt in higher education. So I don't want to talk about the achievement gap. It's a different kind of gap. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's an ethical gap. It's a morality gap. And so that's why the title. So this is part of my staff. As you can see, they're all women. And it was not, it just sort of happened. Many of them have been first my students and then they joined my staff. And these are some of the consultants that I use to work on campuses. And here are many of the campuses that we work with around the country. As Ed mentioned, we develop tools that enable college campuses examine how racialization happens in their outcomes. So we work with the Coast Guard Academy. We work with many community colleges because, you know, community colleges have been the main entry point into higher education for minoritized students. And so what I'm going to share with you a little bit of today is how we work with campuses. And I hope that I'm not being too practical, given that you're all liberal arts faculty. But I think that some of the things that I will share might be useful also for what you do, whether here at Westmont or other institutions of higher education represented in this room. So let me start out with the word equity. So in 2000, when I first started the center, I was advised by foundations and by others that I should not lead with the word equity. At that time, it was a no-no. Because most people were speaking about diversity. And I decided that I decided intentionally that I was not going to focus on diversity because the problem in California and in other states, in the Cal State system, in the community college system, was not diversity. They were already diverse. They had passed stage 1 diversity. The majority of these institutions qualify as Hispanic serving institutions. So their problem was accountability for the outcomes of those students who were making them into Hispanic serving institutions. So that's why I decided to focus on equity, racial equity. Now, move forward to 2020, and everybody's talking about equity. It's like trending. It's like, you know, I mean, you can see equity everywhere. And so I would say, you know, they caught up to me finally. So, but what is equity, right? So I think it's really important to define it if we're going to use that term. And the way that we define it at the Center for Urban Education is that equity is about corrective justice. Corrective justice for that unpaid debt, for the many ways in which Latinx, African Americans, indigenous populations, and also Asian American populations have been excluded from higher education. And in the case of African Americans in particular, they were excluded legally if you think about Jim Crow laws. Another way in which we define equity is that it's an anti-racist project, that equity is about anti-racism in policies and in practices. And if you have read the new book by Ibram Kendi, it is a really, on becoming an anti-racist, it's a really great exposition about how we can think about policy in terms of either racist or anti-racist. And then finally, that we cannot talk about equity without talking about whiteness. And I'm not talking about white people, I'm talking about whiteness as a process, as a practice, as a cultural practice. And so that's how we think of equity, and maybe when we have our conversation, we can talk some more about this if you think about equity in different ways. So now, most people think that equity is the same thing as equality. And one of the things that we need to understand is that when we say equality, we're imagining a just world, right? That everybody has the same height ladder to the diploma. And when we talk about equal educational opportunity, in many ways, that's what we're thinking about. But the fact is that, the world is not equal, and that there are many students who come with all of these assets that make their ladder to the diploma much shorter. And then you have the students who are over here to the right, who are coming almost from way under, who have been deprived of all of these assets that help, for instance, students at USC be successful. And so this is the reality of our system of higher education. Here in California, I don't know how many of you know, the public schools in California, except in very wealthy areas, are highly segregated. I mean, Los Angeles high schools are essentially 90-some-odd% Latinx. And the ratio of counselors to students, it's 1 to whatever have there 1,000 or more, and it's the same thing in community colleges where they're predominantly concentrated, so that inequality also gets reproduced at the community colleges and also in some of the Cal State system institutions. So the point for us is that this ladder, which is the minoritized ladder, is broken. And it's broken by all of these things because, I don't know if you probably here don't do remediation at Westmont. You don't, divert the majority of your students into non-credit college courses as they do in community colleges. They are put in courses in English and math that are that don't count, and they're being placed there by the use of an assessment test that has nothing to do with what they were taught in high school. Now, I mentioned before the idea of anti-racist policy, so here's a good example. The remediation policies were racist because the most impacted students were Black and Latinx students. But now, under the new Chancellor for California Community Colleges, Eloy Ortiz Oakley, we have had policy that eliminates. So community colleges can no longer do remedial education. They have to put students directly into college level English and math and provide them with what they call core requisite courses to assist them to be successful. So when we talk about diversity, here's part of the point. We're talking about just bringing more students into into this broken ladder. And that's why we need to talk about equity. And for us, then, in our work at the Center for Urban Education, is how to fix that ladder. And that's part of the ways in which we do it. And I will provide examples. Another way of thinking about equity is that it has two dimensions. One is an accountability dimension, and the other one is a critical dimension. So here at Westmont, I tried to look at your data, but it was hard for me to find it. I know that you have about 20, maybe, I don't know if I'm right, okay, so you correct me. I think you have about 28 African American students, maybe more now. Maybe I looked at the wrong data. And you have about 74 Latinx students. I don't know what these numbers represent in terms of the percentage of your total, but does anybody know what proportion of your entire student body is Latinx? Is it 10%, 5%, 12%? Okay. So when I say accountability, I imagine that Westmont must have a lot of really good programs. Like, I don't know, do you have an honors program? Okay. Proportionality would be that if we look at who is in that honors program, hopefully 12% will be Latinx. That's what I mean by accountability. Or that among all of the students who earned their baccalaureate this past June, that among those who earned a 3.5 GPA, that at least 12% would be Latinx. And that's the way in which we advocate to look at data to be able to see what is really happening. So that's the accountability perspective, and I'm happy to talk more about that if you have other questions. But the one that people have a difficult time understanding is the critical perspective on equity. So I have this sculpture, which is in Copenhagen, and if you see this sculpture, you can see that it is a very frail man with a very heavy woman on his shoulders. And this is a sculpture that was built in order to depict the wealth inequality in the world. And the inscription is, "I am sitting on the back of a man. He is sinking under the burden. I would do anything to help him except step down from his back." And to me, that depicts perfectly what the critical dimension of equity is and what the problem is that we have. You see, we all say we want more racially minoritized students to earn degrees, right, to be as successful. But we will not consider how whiteness might be implicated in the solutions that we come up with. And we also say we want to diversify the faculty. Do we say that? Yeah? But we are not always willing to look at the many ways in which our hiring processes, in fact, prevent us. You know, we're not willing to step off the back of our hiring processes. So that's the critical perspective for me. And I will say that in order to address these issues, we have to reconsider how we do things and what it is that we value. Okay, so now let me move on. So here's part of the problem. We talk about first-generation students, right? I don't know if you do here at Westmont, but in community colleges and in other institutions, there's a lot of talk about first-generation students, and it's kind of a euphemism for students of color. So one of the chair of the math department at Community College of Aurora in Colorado said to me one day, well, why don't we think about first-generation equity practitioners, right? And we think about them in terms of what they need to learn to become equity-minded. So most of us are, in fact, first-generation equity practitioners because we were never taught how to we were never taught the pedagogy that would enable us to create as much success for Black and Latinx students and Indigenous students as we do for white students. So we find that this is a good way of thinking about the nature of the problem. And you see, the problem is that Professor John has been socialized into thinking that students are the ones who create their own success by their motivation, by being engaged, by investing effort. So when Professor John sees that Black students or Latinx students in his biochemistry class are not doing well, he says they don't know how to study, or they don't know how to be good college students, and they are not motivated. And if it's Latinx students, he will say they work too many hours out of, to help support their families. So there's all of these, myths, both about the students, their motivation. The fact is that Professor John, remember the ladder that I showed you, and the ladder over here? Professor John, because he has gone to Ivy League schools, is not aware of that ladder, that there are shorter ladders and longer ladders. And so, but rather than blaming Professor John, we have to figure out how to develop his skills. So, and to do that, we need to think about how Professor John can be involved in changing structures, practices, and routines. So quickly, this is what I mean that Professor John needs to learn. He needs to learn to become race conscious and aware of racial identity, his own included, because in this case, Professor John is white. He needs to learn how to use data at the course level. He needs to be able to see the patterns of racialization in his biochemistry course by looking at grades by race and ethnicity. And this is something that I will show you what happens when you do that. And he also needs to take into account the racial consequences of taking for granted practices. So, a lot of times as faculty we say, let's do group work, right? Get into your groups, right? And we don't think that there are actually racial consequences when in our classes there are very few Black or minoritized students, and that other students in the class are actually making assumptions about them, and they are not always helping them feel part of the group. And we do a lot of things like that in higher education without thinking about the racial consequences. The other aspect of Professor John is that he's very powerful. He is at a research university maybe, or even if he's not at a research university, he's at a community college. He has power. He has the power of his position. He has the power of networks. He has the power of information. And he can choose to use that power on behalf of students who may not need it, who are already privileged, or he can choose to use that power for minoritized students. So in the research that I have done around STEM, I have come across Latino, and the word Latino, STEM faculty in the sciences who are themselves, they are the first in their families to go to college, and what they do with their Latino students is very different. They will actually choose the students to work in their labs, not the brightest or the ones that are performing, at the highest level, but they will choose the average students, Latino students, that they can mentor into developing a scientific identity. So that's what I mean. We don't always think of who are we using our power for. And the last one is to be able to view the institution as a racialized space. So how do we think? There are many ways of thinking about change. So some of you may recognize this. This is what's called an activity setting in cultural historical activity theory. And so for us, the way that we think about change is through this activity setting. And so we can think about the subjects, right? Their faculty, their tutors, deans, department chairs, and those subjects are involved in this activity setting to get to some outcome. And to do that, they use artifacts. And syllabi are artifacts of practice, and textbooks and grade books and teaching materials. So rather than trying to change Professor John's mindset, what we work at is helping him look at those artifacts through the lens of racial equity and to see for himself how awful his syllabi might be, and how his syllabi might not be an artifact to mediate racial equity. So what I'm saying is that to bring about change, we can focus on those artifacts, and language is also an artifact, by the way. And when you do that, you can bring about change in how individuals maybe think and act. And so for us, we're extremely practical. This is how we do our work. And I will show it to you. But before I do, so I mentioned action research. So what our center does, so, since you're all academics here, so most of the times when we do research, we do it either, and this seems to be screwed up a little bit, but we do what is called third-person research, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. We're going out to places and studying them. We're doing interviews or we're doing surveys, but it's always in the third person. And what action research and action inquiry are what's called second person and first person research. And what that means is we at the center, as second person researchers, we create tools that then Professor Johns use to do action inquiry of their own practices. So I'm going to go quickly here. So these are the kinds of tools that our center has created. So for instance, documents, right? You have a lot of documents here at Westmont. You have not only syllabi, but I bet that you have a strategic plan. And what you can do is, and this is actually a page from a strategic plan from another college. And what we teach practitioners to do is to code them, and to code them using different symbols, and to code them for instance, for the mention of African American students, Latinx, and we have a whole set of language to look for and to code documents. And then, you end up with something like this, which enables me to see, for instance, that in this case, in this document, all students was mentioned 17 times. And what's wrong with that? Well, this is a Hispanic serving institution. And when you're saying all students, the imagined all is always a white student. So even though we may say we care about all students, we're really thinking about the white student. We rarely ever think about the African American or Latinx students. So that's why it's important for us to count things like that. The other one is that here in this strategic plan, there is a mention about students with potential from disadvantaged educational backgrounds. And to us, that's a signal that these students are being positioned as disadvantaged, and which to us is a deficit perspective of these students. So another way that we do this work is by mapping. So what you're seeing here is the grade book of a faculty member in mathematics, and instead of the names of the students, is their race and ethnicity is identified, and what you see symbols for the submission of assignments. You will see symbols for how students performed in tests, in quizzes, and so forth. So now what I'm going to show you is what happened when the math faculty member who did this, what he learned.
Welcome everyone. My name is James Gray. I am mathematics faculty at the Community College of Aurora, and I am an affiliate of the Center for Urban Education out of USC's Rosseau School of Education. And today we are here with our guest, Jason Burke. Welcome, Jason.
Hi James. Hi everybody.
Hi. So we invited Jason. He has been part of the tutor process that we have conducted with Colorado community colleges. And he has done participatory action research that has focused on race-conscious inquiry into his own classroom practices. And we wanted to invite you today, Jason, because the inquiries for you led to some immediate action. So we first wanted you to start talking about what the process was like for you, and then we wanted you to share one of those inquiries and what kind of actions it led you to take. So,
Okay, right. Well, first of all, of course, CCD joined the Q team with other community colleges nearly 2 years ago now. And I think it's been a real eye-opener as to actually see some of the data that we actually had to look at and collect. So if you take a look at this first slide, what I had here was given to us by the college to look at our successes over, let's say, what it is here, fall 2017 to spring 2018. So now I can look at this data and go, okay, that's 65.4%. This is my college algebra. That's maybe like an average success in college algebra, but it doesn't really kind of show really or reflect the successes of minoritized students. So once we get the disaggregated data, which we weren't able to look at before this, and maybe if we move on to the next slide. Okay, so now if we go back to the first slide again, James, if you don't mind, let's go back to the first slide. So I look at this and go, right, 65.4%. Okay, that's average. Thinking of students, I'm not thinking about any one particular student in general. That's my classes. I have a 65.4% pass rate. So again, if we move back to that second slide, now all of a sudden I can say, oh, wow, so that's 64%, actually 65% compromises mainly white students being successful and Latinx students being not as successful. So I start to think, I've not really thought about minoritized students before and their success within my classes. I just thought that maybe students come to my class, they are either successful, they're not successful, are they putting the work in, are they dropping out of class early? But I hadn't thought about who, or who's kind of just not been as successful as other students. So when I look at this, always I start to think, right, what can I do to make Latinx students more successful? Now this is the big thing. The first thing I thought about was the awareness. This is it, it's being aware of this. I hadn't been aware of this before. So that's what the biggest thing I felt that first week being with the Q team was, now I can realise what's something I can actually do for my students in the class. Can I make my Latinx students more successful? So I have to think about, okay, the ideas that I can put into my classroom, my everyday classroom experiences. So if we take a look at the next slide. Now what this is showing is just a little activity that we did springtime last year, and that was just after about 3 weeks maybe, we looked at maybe some of the assignments the students were doing with their attendance. So if you look at this, the attendance is actually very good. It's just a problem with the assignments. Now if you look at that, it's kind of like, well, the students, only a few of them are actually being successful in assignments. In fact, when you look at this, the white students weren't successful here, but yet it showed that they are successful overall in the class. So I think that's just maybe a slight anomaly in so much as these were early days. I had some students who...
I'm going to move a little bit more.
Just short before the class starts, we have a room full of students, and we just start, we say hi, we kind of just a quick maybe chat to them. When we go into the syllabus, we talk about the syllabus.
So these are the things that he started doing in his class. And so he started to change what he did in the first day of class to establish a better relationship with students. But he also made changes in the homework assignments. So rather than having the students go home and do the homework, he started the homework in class. and which then gave the students a sense that in fact they could complete the homework. And that actually, so he did that. And then the other thing that he did was he started reaching out to the Latinx students in very overt ways to establish a relationship with them. So what I'll do now is, let's see if I can get to where he shows what happened in his class. So this is, okay, so you saw before his grade book, so you can see that it has changed tremendously in terms of the colors, and so that students are all doing better. And let me see if I can get to the actual data. Okay, so
and I think it's because I am talking to them. They are feeling part
so
of
you
the
can
class.
see
I am
the
talking
change
more
for the
and more,
Latinx
learning together
students.
more. They're not just some students that I don't get to know.
They
and
went
maybe
from
outside the
a 33% success rate to an almost 86% success rate. Now, you can also see that the white students went up, but the gap between the two groups got a lot smaller. But so it's very difficult, obviously, to attribute the change to the changes that he made. We have continued monitoring his class to see if this is being sustained, and it is. But the important thing is he believes that this is what happened, and so he's going to continue doing these practices. And our data for this work in Colorado, which involves 5 different community colleges, is showing that there are improvements in all of the math faculty that are working with these new tools that we created for them, including one that relates to the syllabus. So I'm going to go on here. And one of the issues is that we're always asked is, why do you focus on racial equity, right? We're asked, what about socioeconomic status? Or what about some other difference? And one of the things that we always say is that you cannot escape color. You see color. You don't necessarily see socioeconomic status. And you can only be colorblind if you have been medically diagnosed as being colorblind. And then the other aspect of it is what I already said before, this notion of the unpaid debt, that racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities, have been subject to legally sanctioned exclusion from access to education. And in the case of Mexican Americans, in particular Mexican Americans, the prohibition against the use of their language. And we have financial aid policies to, maybe they're not robust enough, but we still do have financial aid policies that address issues of low socioeconomic status. And the one thing that we had, affirmative action, has been almost for all purposes eliminated. And in fact, I did today is a heavy day for me. I did an hour and a half webinar on faculty hiring today. And one of the things that always comes up is this notion of why focusing on racial equity and when focusing on faculty hiring is, well, it's illegal now. It's illegal to talk about race in faculty hiring, and in fact, it's not. You can talk about diversifying the faculty. You can say Westmont College has 12% Latinx student, but our faculty does not have 12% Latinx, and we are particularly interested in faculty who have the experience to work with those students. There is nothing illegal about it. And then finally, education is about democracy. And if we don't pay attention to racial equity, then we're compromising the democratic purposes of higher education. So I'm going to actually probably stop here, right? Because I have used up too much time. And what I would like to then do is just finish up with actually, let's see if I can. So these are some of the, let's see how this, I have a staff that is very savvy with PowerPoint. But these are some of the obstacles to the work that we're doing, It's essentially claiming to not see race. And we have many faculty and others who say, I treat everyone the same. Have you heard that? I don't see race, I don't see gender, I don't care whether you're purple or, pink, or they'll say, I only see humans, right? So all of those are impediments to doing the kind of work that I'm talking about. And the other thing, skirting around race, and actually these are all from the book. Here's a plug for the book. Talking about race without talking about it, right? Skirting around it, using euphemisms. Underserved people, the least well-served people, as opposed to the best-served people. I mean, I hear these comments a lot of times because people are afraid, for some reason, to be direct about racism, racial inequality, resisting calls to disaggregate data by race and ethnicity. That might be something you want to look in terms of your website, in terms of how your data are presented. What I already said, substituting race talk with poverty talk. And these other things, for the myth of universalism, number 9, that actually comes from the work of Robin DiAngelo. So remember when I showed you all students, and there were 17 in that document? That's universalism. So when we want to talk about all students, that itself becomes an obstacle to addressing racial inequity. And so I'll stop here, and what I will say to conclude is that in higher education, although I think colleges like yours are safe from this, but in higher education, there is currently a penchant for structural solutions that can be scaled up. You may not be familiar with this because you're insulated in many ways from that movement. So there are all of these big structural solutions, particularly aimed at the Cal States, at the community colleges, and what I am advocating for, which I think is in the spirit of the liberal arts, is that the kinds of changes we need to be able to say we're not dreaming still, is that we need to think about this as a human problem. It's a learning problem. It's a problem that can be solved, not maybe all of it, but mostly by the ways in which faculty become more race and critically conscious and change their practices. So that's essentially my message. Thank you very much, and here comes the break.